Okay, our next kind of factoring that we're going to look at is called factoring by grouping. This is one of my favorite kinds of factoring because it's the easiest one to spot. Because the day before this, where we were factoring out the greatest common factor, you can do that whether it's a binomial, trinomial, or however many terms it has. You should always look for a common factor because it's going to make any other factoring that you have to do easier to have smaller numbers and that sort of thing. So from there, once we've learned how to factor out the greatest common factor, there are other ways that we can factor things where there's not a greatest common factor. And for that, we typically decide what to do based on how many terms there are. So you'll notice that all of these on this page have 4 terms. And that's supposed to be a very clear indicator that either you could factor out a greatest common factor maybe, but either this factors by grouping or it does not factor at all. And so let me walk you through here. How do we factor by grouping? And it's going to use what we did yesterday or whenever it was that you did it. And instead of us, like if there was a greatest common factor for the whole thing, we could take it out and make our numbers smaller. But in this case, there's not. And so instead, we're going to group the first 2 terms together and the last 2 terms together. And we're basically going to do 2 separate greatest common factors. So for the first 2, 35n cubed plus 20n squared, what do they have in common that I can divide by? So I can divide both of these by 5. And then n cubed and n squared, I can divide them both by n squared. So I'm going to write down 5n squared, and then inside of my parentheses, I'm going to put what happens if I do this division. So 35 divided by 5 is 7. N cubed divided by n squared leaves us with an n. And then 20 divided by 5 is 4. N squared divided by n squared cancels. So these first 2 terms factor into this, 5n squared times 7n plus 4. We're going to kind of start over in some ways and do this again, but with the second set of terms. So 42n and 24, they don't have an n in common because 24 doesn't have an n, but they are both even, so 2 goes in. Does something higher than 2 go in? Yes, 6. 42 is 6 times 7, 64 is 6 times 4. And that means I can divide these both by 6. So I'm going to write next to what I already have plus, and then 6, and then in parentheses write what happens if I divide these both by 6. 7n plus 4. Now, the whole thing you're looking for with factoring by grouping is for these 2 parentheses that we have to actually be the exact same. They are both 7n plus 4. That's actually how I realized that something bigger than 2 went into 42 and 24, is because I was like, well, if I just divide by 2, I'm not going to get what's in this parentheses, so I better divide by something bigger than 2. The reason that this is helpful is because if they have this in common, right? If they have this in common, then we can divide by 7n plus 4. In other words, we can do greatest common factor. We can say this is the same as 7n plus 4 times what's left over, which is the 5n squared plus 6. Now, this may be a little bit weird, okay? And if it is, just, try to figure out while I'm doing the examples what's going on. Definitely ask questions if you have them, but that's the idea here. We're going to group the first 2 and see what they have in common. In this case, they both have a 3 and a k squared. If it helps you to write underneath it the division, then absolutely continue to do that, but I would prefer to not have to keep writing it, because I can just think in my head, okay, I'm dividing by 3, so that's 7. I'm dividing by k squared, so that's going to leave me with a k. And then minus, and 6 divided by 3 is 2. Then our k squareds just cancel. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the last 2. So 35 and 10 both are divisible by 5. So, and they don't have a k in common. So 35 divided by 5 is 7, and we still have that k. Negative 10 divided by 5 is negative 2. They have 7k minus 2 in common, and if I take that away from these two things, then I'm left with 3k squared plus 5. That is my answer. Now, would you like to see some trickiness? Because there definitely is some. Let's start this off, though, like normal. We're going to take out the 5 and the r squared that they both have. So that's going to be 1r, or just r. And then negative 35 divided by 5 is negative 7. And the r squareds are going to cancel. Now, when I look at these second two, here's where the trickiness happens. Negative r and plus 7 don't have anything in common. So we could write plus 1 and then have negative r plus 7. But that does not match. Their signs are backwards from what we want them to be. And if that's the case, that our signs are backwards, instead of writing plus 1, what we do is we write minus 1. We take out a negative. So if I divide negative r by negative 1, I get a positive r. If I divide 7 by negative 1, I get a negative 7. And now they match. Okay, so that's something that you might encounter that you know what to go for because you did the first one, and then you have to figure out how do I make the second one work so that it has the correct signs or the correct numbers. So they have r minus 7 in common, and 4r squared minus 1 would be left over. Something kind of similar, I think, is going to happen on this one. So these two do not have a number in common, but have an m squared. So that leaves us with 7m minus 3. Lots of 7s on here. And then on this one, we do have a 5 in common, but if I notice, okay, these signs are backwards, I want it to be a plus and then a minus, then I'm going to go ahead and take out a minus 5, or divide by a minus 5 instead of a positive 5. And that will give me positive 7m, and it will give me a negative 3. So they have 7m minus 3 in common, and that leaves me with m squared minus 5. Go ahead and do a lot of practice here. The more practice, the merrier. Make sure that you are checking your answers so that you know that you're doing it correctly. And if you're not, you can use the solutions to try to figure out why. You can rewatch the video, or you can message me for help, and one way or another, we'll get it figured out. But this has been Factoring by Grouping.